So here's the first thing that God does. The church experiences God's peace. Look what happens in this story. About that time, Herod the king laid violent hands on some who belonged to the church. He killed James, the brother of John, with a sword. And when he saw that it pleased the Jews, he proceeded to arrest Peter also. This was during the days of unleavened bread. And then he seized them. He put them in prison, delivering them over 4 squads of soldiers. So 4 squads of soldiers. That's going to come in really handy later in the message. Pay attention. Intending that after the Passover to bring him out to the people. So Peter was kept in prison, but earnest prayers was made to God by the church. Here we go. We're having a little flashback. In order for me to understand the text, what we say at Redemption, you have to understand the context. And so we're not just picking and choosing verses. We actually just preach through books of the Bible and let the chips fall through their may. So we are in Acts chapter 12. So we've been in Acts since last Easter, and we'll be in Acts until Jesus comes back or we finish the new building, whichever one comes first. Hopefully we get into this building before the day of the Lord, all right? So we're in Acts. And what we've seen in Acts is that the church grows. Jesus says that you will be my witnesses, Jerusalem, Judea, Samaria, to the ends of the earth. We've seen Jerusalem, Judea, Samaria, and then last week we saw the beginning of the ends of the earth with the church in Antioch. We'll meet them again next week. And the way the church grew was always through persecution. So they're being arrested, beaten, thrown in prison. We see Stephen is killed. They're no longer safe at home. They have to scatter across all of the region, and everywhere they go, they keep telling people about Jesus. And last week closed with Paul and Barnabas going back to Jerusalem with the tithes to be able to bring a blessing to the church in Jerusalem. When they arrive, persecution is still happening. And the persecution's got so intense now where we see James is actually murdered. So question, who is the characters in the story we're reading today? Well, the first person we meet is James. He was an apostle. He was one of Jesus's disciples. And he later became a leader in the early church as well. He walked with Jesus for 3 years. He's been there since the very beginning. That's James. And he's murdered. He's run through with a sword. Church history tells us actually beheaded. And then we see Peter. He's the leader of the apostles. He's the pastor of the first church, preaches Pentecost. 3,000 people are saved. The church is born. That's Peter, right? We've got to know Peter really well over the last several messages. But who's Herod? Now, if you're a student of the Bible, then you've come across the name Herod many times. And you wonder, how does it keep showing up all the time? Like, how is he here and there and there? And like, how does he? Actually, there's a lot of Herods. Herod is what is called a tetrarch, because he was not a real king, because Israel was actually occupied by Rome. They were still slaves or sojourners. They didn't have true freedom at that time. They were not their own nation. So Caesar, the ruler over Rome, he placed him there as a governor to be able to make sure that no riots or insurrections would break out, keep the peace, let there not be any problems. So that's what the Herods were. I have a chart to show you all the different Herods in the Bible. The first Herod is Herod the Great. Herod the Great is the one who killed all the babies trying to kill baby Jesus. So when you read Matthew, the slaughter of the innocents, that's this guy's grandpa. Well, then we see another Herod. This is the guy who killed John the Baptist, because John the Baptist was like, hey, you shouldn't sleep with your brother's wife. And he was like, no. And then John the Baptist was like, that's nasty. And then they killed him. If you want to listen to the full sermon, you can find it. It's in the Gospel of Mark series. So enjoy, because 2 families left our church over it. So you might be able to get something out of it too. All right. And then later we're going to meet another Herod, where it says he's the one that Paul preaches to in Rome before Paul's killed. But this is Herod Agrippa. And Herod Agrippa, he loved royalty. He was bougie, right? And so what he would do is he would go to Rome all the time, and he'd rub elbows with all of the really important, impressive, bougie people all the time. And he had a loud mouth, and he was always talking. He might have been the king of Israel, but he was actually just a drama queen. That's what he was. Because he would go around and he would say, Tiberius is Caesar. I think Caligula should be the Caesar. And he started kind of running his mouth, telling everybody that I wish Tiberius was dead and Caligula was the Caesar. Now, do you know who Caligula is? He is known as the mad tyrant of Rome, probably the most brutal outside of Nero of any of the Caesars they had. Like, he slept with all of his sisters, killed all of his brothers, and then put a horse in the Senate. That's how crazy this guy was. Well, Tiberius mysteriously dies 6 months later. Tiberius actually throws Herod in prison and then dies. And then Caligula becomes the emperor. And in order for what Caligula does is he sets Herod free because of all the different politicking that he did for him. And he gives him more land than his grandfather had, Herod the Great. He also gives him a gold chain the size of the weight of the chains that he wore while he's in prison, and then placed him back over Israel with one job, and that was to kill the Christians. That was his job. And so far in Acts, what we've seen is that Saul is persecuting the Christians from a religious standard, and now we know that Herod is the one who is allowing this to happen from a political point. But either way, on both sides, there is persecution that is happening, so much so that James died, and now Peter, their pastor, is once again arrested and thrown into prison. And this is why it says right here, when he saw that it pleased the Jews, he proceeded to throw Peter in prison also. Now, here's my question for you. When you are suffering, when you are hurting, where do you run? Put yourself in that position of the early church. Your pastor's in prison, your friend has been murdered, you've lost your home and your livelihood, everything has been taken away from you. What do you do in that moment? Do you run from God? Do you blame God? Do you deconstruct your faith? And do you try to start pointing the fingers at everybody and you blame your church and you blame the leadership? Do you run from God or do you run to God? When you're hurting, when you're suffering, what do you do? Where do you go? Where do you turn? Do you run to numb your problems? Do you run to escape your problems? Do you try to justify your behavior and actions in the midst of it? Or do you take that pain and go to God with the pain? What does the church do? It says, look what it says. It says, earnest prayer for him was made on behalf of the church. The church didn't run from God in their pain. They ran to God, and in the middle of their pain, God met them, and God gave them peace. Peace to continue, peace to move forward, peace to make it through the day. In the middle of their pain, they gathered around, and God met them in that moment, and he blessed them with peace. Don't run from God in your pain, run to God. What we read about in Acts is what many therapists and psychologists would say a compound trauma. It's not where one thing happens, it's where dozens of things happen and they all culminate and build on top of each other. It'd be very similar, and an example is if you get in a car crash, you get injured, now there's the pain and the PTSD of the crash, and then you lose your job, and now your finances are shot, and then your family starts falling apart, and now all of a sudden you and your spouse are fighting, and then it leads to a divorce, all because of the one single event. It was that one event that triggered multiple events. That's what we read in the book Acts, compound trauma. And it fulfills and culminates in something that is known as grief. Now, grief is a weird emotion. We don't really know what to do with grief. Because we can't really just single it out, because on one day you're angry, the next day you're sad, one day you're accepting it, the next day you're denying it, and all these things can happen in the same day. It's the strangest emotion and feeling, and so many of us, we try to process grief when what we should do and could do is go to God in prayer. Because oftentimes what we do is we call the phone, we call somebody, we try to figure something out, we try to find our way through it, and we're processing, but processing pain without praying to God is not actually just helping you heal, it's producing grief and worse, anxiety and fear and trauma, reliving the worst days of your life over and over again. But when we process our pain with God, then we experience God's peace, his presence, his goodness, his grace for us, even in the middle of that situation. Here's how I put it in your notes. To grieve is human, but to lament is Christian. Lamenting is a form of prayer. I bet you didn't know that, right? It's a form of prayer where you go to God with your pain and your hurt and your bitterness and your anger and your questions and your doubts, and you go to God and say, God, I don't know why, and I don't know what's going on, and I am hurting and I'm suffering and I'm turning to you and my pain and my problem. That's lamenting. But we're not good at lamenting. We're not good at processing pain, especially processing pain with God in prayer. See, at the church I grew up in, if something was hard, they just said, pray harder. Right? I mean, you're not seeing the walls fall down, march around Jericho one more time, right? But there's some times where you don't have an answer. You don't have a next step. You don't have anything you could do. You could just get alone with God and just say, God, I am hurting right now. And that's when God steps in and brings peace. To lament is human. To grieve is human. Everyone is going to grieve regardless of what they believe about God, but what you believe about God will change the way you grieve.